The autumn of 1847 came to Thornhaven like a curse whispered from the moors themselves, bringing with it winds that howled through the narrow lanes and rains that fell in sheets, so thick the villagers could scarcely see their neighbours' cottages across the way. The Yorkshire village huddled in the valley like a creature seeking shelter, its stone buildings dark with wet, its chimneys struggling to send smoke upward against the relentless press of the gale. In the tavern called the Shepherd's Rest, men gathered close to the fire and spoke in low voices, their words nearly swallowed by the shriek of wind against the shutters, and always their talk circled back to the same subject, the great house on the hill, Blackmore Hall, and the man who had returned to claim it after years of absence. The Widowmaker, old Thomas Finch muttered into his ale, and the name passed from lip to lip like a contagion, carrying with it the weight of 2 dead brides and a reputation black as the storm clouds that perpetually seemed to gather above the estate's crumbling towers. Lord Marcus Ashford had arrived 3 weeks prior, in a carriage drawn by horses as black as mourning cloth, and in all that time not a soul in the village had received so much as a word of greeting from the master of Blackmore Hall. The servants who remained from the old days, and precious few they were, for most had fled after the second Lady Ashford's death, reported that he walked the halls at all hours of the night, that he took his meals alone in chambers where the curtains were never drawn, that he had ordered the entire east wing sealed and forbidden anyone from entering upon pain of immediate dismissal. Catherine had been the first, they whispered, sweet Catherine with her golden hair and gentle manner, dead in childbirth along with the babe that might have been heir to all those cold and lonely acres, and some said Lord Ashford had never recovered from that loss, that something in him had broken beyond all mending. But then had come Lydia, the second bride, a match arranged by families seeking advantage, and she too had perished, found at the base of the cliffs beyond the garden, her body broken upon the rocks, her eyes open to the grey and indifferent sky. Accident, the authorities had ruled, though the word murder lived on the tongue of every gossip in 3 counties, and who could say what truly happened in a house so isolated, so shrouded in mist and secrecy, where a man might do whatever dark deeds his heart desired, with none to witness or intervene. The storm raged on through the night, tearing branches from trees and sending tiles skittering from rooftops, and up on the hill, Blackmore Hall stood against the tempest like a monument to grief itself, its windows dark save for a single light that burned in the highest tower, where the Widowmaker kept his solitary vigil over a domain of shadows and whispered sins. The vicarage of Street. Michael's stood at the edge of Thornhaven, where the village met the wild, a modest dwelling of weathered stone and climbing ivy that had sheltered generations of spiritual shepherds and their families, and it was here that Eleanor Hartwell had spent all 24 years of her life, watching the seasons turn over the moors and wondering, in the secret chambers of her heart, what lay beyond the horizon she had never crossed. She was not beautiful in the way that turned heads in crowded rooms. Her features were too strong for that, her jaw too determined, her grey eyes too direct in their assessment of the world. But there was something in her bearing that commanded attention nonetheless, a stillness that spoke of depths unplumbed, of thoughts that ranged far beyond the narrow confines of parish duties and Sunday sermons. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 12, carried off by a fever that swept through the village one brutal winter, and in the years since she had become everything to her father, daughter and nurse and housekeeper, and increasingly the true heart of the parish itself. For Reverend Hartwell's health had been failing for 3 years now, his lungs weakened by the same damp air that crept through every crack in the old vicarage walls. She rose each morning before dawn to light the fires and prepare her father's medicines, spent her days visiting the sick and the poor with baskets of bread and jars of preserves, read to the elderly widows who could no longer see well enough to manage their own scriptures, and taught the village children their letters in the small schoolroom attached to the church. All of this performed with a quiet competence that the villagers had long since ceased to remark upon, for Eleanor's devotion was as much a part of Thornhaven's landscape as the stone walls that divided the fields or the church spire that rose against the perpetually grey sky. But in the evenings, when her father slept and the candle burned low in her small chamber beneath the eaves, Eleanor permitted herself to dream, and her dreams were fed by the books she borrowed from the lending library in the market town 10 miles, distant volumes of philosophy and natural history, accounts of travels to distant lands, novels that spoke of passions far removed from the gentle pieties of a vicar's household. She read Wollstonecraft in secret, pondering questions of a woman's purpose and potential that she dared not voice aloud, and she traced her fingers over maps of places she knew she would never see, Paris and Rome and Constantinople, cities of art and music, and ideas that glittered in her imagination like stars glimpsed through parting clouds. "You think too much, Eleanor," her father often said with fond exasperation, and perhaps he was right, for what good were thoughts that could never become actions, dreams that could never take flight beyond the boundaries of duty and devotion that circumscribed her world as surely as the moors circumscribed the village? And yet she could not stop herself from wondering, from yearning, from feeling that somewhere within her lived a self that had never been given permission to exist, a woman waiting to be called forth by some catalyst she could not name and dared not hope would ever arrive. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle on the October morning when Eleanor made her way through the churchyard of St. Michael's, her basket laden with autumn flowers for the graves of those parishioners who had no living family to remember them, and it was there, among the weathered headstones and the yew trees that had stood sentinel over Thornhaven's dead for 3 centuries, that she first saw him, a figure so still he might have been carved from the same stone as the monuments around him, standing before a plot in the far corner where no marker rose to identify the soul interred beneath the sodden earth. She knew him at once, though she had never laid eyes upon him before, for who else in all the parish would wear a greatcoat of such fine black wool? Who else would stand with that particular rigidity of bearing that spoke of military discipline or aristocratic breeding? Who else would be visiting this forgotten corner of consecrated ground where, she realized with a start, the unnamed grave must hold some connection to Blackmore Hall and its master? Lord Marcus Ashford did not move as she approached along the gravel path, did not acknowledge her presence even as her footsteps surely reached his ears, and Eleanor found herself slowing, her breath catching in her throat, her fingers tightening on the handle of her basket as she drew near enough to observe the details that village gossip had failed to provide, the sharp planes of his face beneath the brim of his hat, the hollows beneath cheekbones that suggested sleepless nights and missed meals, the set of his jaw that might have been arrogance, but struck her instead as something far more painful, a clenching against words or cries that must not be permitted to escape. His hands hung at his sides, ungloved despite the chill, and she noticed they were not the soft hands of a gentleman of leisure, but bore the calluses and competent strength of one who had worked with them, who had perhaps healed with them, if the rumors of his medical past held any truth. She should have passed by, should have attended to her task and left the master of Blackmore Hall to his private communion with the dead, but something held her rooted to the path, some compulsion she could not name, and in that moment of stillness he turned his head, and their eyes met across the rain-misted air. She had expected coldness, had prepared herself for the cruel disdain the villagers attributed to him, but what she saw in that brief, unguarded instant, before his expression shuttered into blankness, was something else entirely, a grief so vast and raw it seemed to swallow all the light from the grey morning, a devastation that spoke not of a monster's callousness, but of a soul that had been shattered and had never found its way back to wholeness. Asterisk, he is not what they say. Asterisk, Eleanor thought, with sudden fierce certainty, even as Lord Ashford turned away without a word, even as he strode past her toward the lich gate, with steps that carried him into the mist, like a spectre, returning to the realm of shadows from which he had briefly emerged. She stood alone among the graves, the rain beginning to fall harder now, and she did not move for a long while, thinking of the unmarked plot and the man who visited it, thinking of grief worn like armor and pain disguised as cruelty, thinking that somewhere beneath the legend of the Widowmaker there existed a truth far more complex and far more sorrowful than any tale whispered over ale in the Shepherd's Rest. The letter arrived on a morning when frost had painted the vicarage windows with crystalline patterns that Eleanor might have found beautiful under other circumstances, delivered by a servant in Blackmore livery, who spoke not a word as he pressed the heavy envelope into her hands and retreated down the path, as though the very stones of St. Michael's might rise up to smite him for his association with that dark house upon the hill. The paper was thick and cream-coloured, the seal pressed in black wax bearing a crest. Eleanor did not recognize a raven clutching a thorned rose. She would later learn the ancient symbol of the Ashford line, and her father's name was inscribed across the front, in handwriting that struck her as surprisingly elegant, the letters formed with a physician's precision rather than an aristocrat's careless flourish. "What does he want with me?" Reverend Hartwell murmured from his chair by the fire, his voice thready with the illness that had kept him confined to the vicarage for nearly a fortnight now, and Eleanor watched his trembling fingers struggle to break the seal, watched his rheumy eyes scan the brief message within, watched the colour drain from his already pallid cheeks as he absorbed whatever request Lord Ashford had seen fit to make of a village vicar, who had never exchanged a single word with the master of Blackmore Hall. "He asks for spiritual counsel," her father said slowly, as though the words themselves were foreign objects he could not quite comprehend. "He writes that he finds himself in need of guidance that only a man of God might provide, and he requests—" "No," he begs, "Eleanor, the man actually uses the word begs that I attend him at my earliest convenience." The Reverend's hands shook as he lowered the letter to his lap, and Eleanor could see the conflict playing across his weathered features. The shepherd's instinct to tend any lost sheep warring with the very human fear of entering the domain of one whom the village had long since condemned as beyond redemption. "You cannot go, Father," Eleanor said firmly, kneeling beside his chair and pressing her hand over his, feeling the fragility of bones beneath skin grown papery with age and illness. "The journey alone would exhaust you, and the damp of that old house." But even as she spoke, she knew what must be done, knew with a certainty that settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and when she met her father's eyes she saw that he knew it too. "You will go in my stead," he said, and it was not a question. "You will bring him the comfort I cannot deliver myself, the prayers and the texts and the promise that God's mercy extends even to those who believe themselves beyond its reach." The village learned of her errand within hours, as villages always do, and by evening a steady stream of visitors had appeared at the vicarage door, each bearing warnings wrapped in the thin guise of Christian concern. Mrs. Blackwood clutching her rosary and speaking of evil that corrupted all it touched. Old Mr. Fenwick muttering about the devil's house and the souls it had swallowed. Young Sarah from the milliner's shop weeping actual tears as she begged Eleanor not to sacrifice herself upon the altar of parish duty. "He murdered them," whispered the blacksmith's wife, her eyes bright with the particular fervour of one who has repeated a story so often she can no longer distinguish rumour from truth. "He murdered them both, and he'll murder you too. Mark my words, Miss Hartwell, no good ever came of crossing that threshold." But Eleanor thought of grey eyes filled with grief rather than malice, thought of a man standing alone in the rain before an unmarked grave, and when she retired to her chamber that night, she began preparing the satchel she would carry to Blackmore Hall, her hands steady even as her heart raced with something that was not quite fear. The road to Blackmore Hall wound upward through a landscape that seemed to grow more desolate with each turn of the hired cart's wheels, the moorland stretching away on either side in undulating waves of brown and purple heather, broken only by outcroppings of dark stone that thrust up from the earth like the bones of some ancient creature long since fallen and forgotten, and Eleanor clutched her satchel against her chest as the driver, a man from the neighbouring village, who had demanded triple his usual fare, and still crossed himself twice before agreeing to make the journey, muttered prayers beneath his breath, and refused to meet her eyes in the small mirror mounted above his seat. The hall revealed itself gradually, first as a distant smudge against the grey November sky, then as a silhouette of towers and chimneys that might once have aspired to grandeur, but now seemed to crouch upon the hillside like a wounded animal waiting to die. And as they drew closer, Eleanor could discern the details of its decay, the ivy that had been permitted to consume entire wings until windows peered out from curtains of withered green like eyes trapped behind a mask, the roof tiles missing in patterns that spoke of years rather than months of neglect, the great iron gates that hung open at crooked angles as though the house had long since ceased to care who entered or departed its grounds. The driver would go no further than those gates, and Eleanor found herself walking the final quarter-mile alone, her boots crunching on gravel that had not been raked in what must have been seasons, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she approached a front door of blackened oak that seemed to absorb what little light the overcast sky provided. She lifted the heavy iron knocker shaped, she noticed with a shiver. Like a raven's skull, and the sound it produced echoed through the interior with a hollowness that suggested vast empty spaces beyond, rooms that had not known warmth or laughter, or the simple comfort of human occupation in far too long. The woman who answered was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine that matched the perpetual mourning of the house itself. Her grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face into an expression of permanent disapproval, and when she spoke her voice carried the particular frost of a servant who has claimed authority in the absence of any master willing to exercise it. "You are the vicar's girl, missus," Crane said, and it was not a question but an accusation, her eyes travelling over Eleanor's simple wool dress and practical bonnet with barely concealed contempt. "You may wait in the library, though I cannot say when or if his lordship will receive you, for he keeps no schedule that any Christian soul might recognize." The library was vast and cold, a fire laid but unlit in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, and Eleanor stood among towering shelves that groaned beneath the weight of volumes she found herself drawn to examine, despite the chill medical texts in Latin and German, anatomical drawings of exquisite and disturbing precision, treatises on diseases of the mind and afflictions of the spirit, and there among them all, tucked between a surgeon's manual and a pharmacopoeia, a slim volume of poetry by Tennyson with pages so worn they spoke of hands that had returned to its comfort again and again, seeking solace in verses about grief and loss and the desperate hope that death was not the end of all things. She had been standing before the shelves for perhaps half an hour, her fingers tracing the spine of a volume on melancholia, when she became aware that she was no longer alone, that the quality of silence in the room had shifted from emptiness to something watched, something waiting. And when she turned, she found Lord Marcus Ashford standing in the doorway with the stillness of a man who had learned to move through the world without disturbing it, as though he had long since concluded that his presence was a contamination best kept contained. He was thinner than she remembered from the churchyard, the bones of his face sharp beneath skin that held the pallor of one who had not seen sunlight in weeks, and his dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, swept back from a forehead lined with the particular furrows that spoke not of age but of thoughts too heavy to bear, and when his grey eyes met hers, Eleanor saw something flicker in their depths. Surprise, perhaps, that she had not fled at his approach, or perhaps merely the reflexive calculation of a predator assessing whether its prey was worth the effort of pursuit. "So the good Reverend sends his daughter to beard the monster in his den," Lord Ashford said, and his voice was exactly as Eleanor had imagined. It would be low and cultured and edged with a cruelty that seemed almost practiced, as though he had rehearsed this particular brand of disdain until it fit him like armor. "How touching that he considers my immortal soul worth risking his only child, though I suspect the calculation was rather simpler than that an aging vicar with one foot in the grave himself has little left to lose, and perhaps he thought you might prove more palatable to my appetites than his own withered offerings." Eleanor felt the colour rise in her cheeks, but she did not step back, did not lower her gaze, and when she spoke her voice carried the steadiness she had cultivated through years of tending the dying and comforting the bereaved, the tone of one who had learned that fear was a luxury the truly useful could not afford. "My father is ill, my lord, too ill to make the journey himself, and he believed that no soul who reached out for guidance should be denied it merely because the messenger was not the one expected." Lord Ashford laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking, sharp and hollow and somehow terribly sad. "Guidance," he repeated, crossing to the cold hearth and bracing one hand against the mantel as though he required its support. "Your father offers guidance through prayer and scripture, through the promise of a merciful God who welcomes the repentant sinner into his embrace. And tell me, Miss Hartwell, what comfort do you imagine such platitudes offer to a man who has watched two women die and knows with the certainty of one who has studied death in all its forms, that no amount of prayer will bring them back, that no scripture will silence the accusations that echo through these halls every night?" Eleanor reached into her satchel and withdrew the texts her father had prepared, the worn prayer book and the passages copied in his trembling hand, and she placed them on the table between them like an offering, like a challenge. "I imagine very little comfort at all, my lord, if you are determined to refuse it before it is even given, but I will leave these nonetheless, and I will return next week to discuss them with you, and the week after that, and the week after that, because my father taught me that the shepherd does not abandon the lost sheep, simply because it bares its teeth and pretends it wishes to be left alone in the wilderness." For a long moment Lord Ashford stared at her, and Eleanor could not read what passed behind those grey eyes, fury perhaps, or bewilderment, or something that might have been the first faint stirring of respect, and then he turned away, presenting her with his back as though she had already ceased to exist. "Mrs. Crane will show you out," he said flatly, "and Miss Hartwell, do not mistake stubbornness for courage, for this house has broken far stronger wills than yours." The whispers found Eleanor before she had even reached the village square, carried on the tongues of women who gathered at the well with buckets they no longer needed to fill, and men who paused in their labours to watch her pass with eyes that held equal measures of pity and morbid fascination, and by the time she entered the baker's shop to purchase her father's bread, she had already heard her name, spoken 3 times in hushed tones that fell silent the moment she drew near, a silence more eloquent than any accusation. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the blacksmith's wife and unofficial keeper of Thornhaven's collective memory, who finally spoke plainly, cornering Eleanor in the narrow aisle between flour sacks and preserves with the determination of one who considered it her Christian duty to save the innocent from their own foolishness, and the words that poured forth painted a portrait so dark that Eleanor felt the chill of Blackmore Hall settle into her bones once more, despite the warmth of the autumn afternoon. Catherine Ashford had been barely 19 when she married Marcus, a gentle creature by all accounts, golden-haired and sweet-natured and desperately in love with the brilliant young physician who had captured her heart during a London season, and they had retreated to Blackmore Hall with dreams of filling its empty rooms with children and laughter and all the quiet joys of a life built on mutual devotion. But the child had come too soon, or perhaps too late, the labour stretching across 3 agonizing days, while Marcus paced the halls and consulted his medical texts, and ultimately stood helpless as his wife and infant son slipped beyond the reach of any earthly medicine, leaving him alone in a house that had briefly known hope and would never know it again. "He buried them himself," Mrs. Pemberton whispered, her eyes bright with the particular gleam of one who has hoarded a secret too long. "In the churchyard, in an unmarked grave, because he said he could not bear to see their names carved in stone. And then he disappeared to London for 2 years, and when he returned he brought her Lydia, Lady Ashford II. And oh, Miss Hartwell, that poor creature was doomed from the moment she crossed the threshold. Lydia had been a cousin's daughter. The story went, a match arranged by families concerned with duty and succession rather than affection, and from the first she had wandered the moors at all hours with wild eyes and wilder hair, speaking to people no one else could see, and weeping for sorrows she could not name, until one November evening she had walked to the edge of the cliffs beyond Blackmore and simply stepped into the waiting darkness below, her body discovered the next morning on the rocks like a broken bird that had forgotten how to fly. The inquest had ruled it accident, the verdict delivered by a magistrate who owed the Ashford family debts too old and too deep to be ignored. But Thornhaven had reached its own conclusions in the quiet hours after the verdict was read, 2 wives dead, 1 lord remaining, and the title that clung to him now like a curse spoken aloud in every tavern and parlour and churchyard gathering. Widowmaker, they called him, and Eleanor walked home through streets that had grown suddenly cold, carrying bread she no longer wished to eat, and questions she was not yet ready to ask. She returned the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the Thursday after that, until the path to Blackmore Hall became as familiar to her feet as the worn stones of her father's church, and each week she found Lord Ashford waiting in the library with his walls of leather-bound grief, his posture arranged into attitudes of contempt that grew increasingly difficult to maintain as the weeks accumulated like fallen leaves outside the darkened windows. And though he greeted her always with barbed words and dismissive gestures, though he mocked her chosen passages and questioned the sanity of a God who would permit such suffering as the world contained, he never once instructed Mrs. Crane to bar the door, never once failed to appear when Eleanor was shown into that cold and dusty room where the fire was never lit and the curtains were never drawn. She began to notice things during these visits, small details that accumulated into a portrait far more complex than the monster of village legend, the way his hands trembled when he reached for the texts she brought, a fine, constant quivering that spoke of nerves stretched past their breaking point, and she recognized that tremor from her father's medical books as the mark of a man who had not slept properly in months or perhaps years, whose body had begun to rebel against the relentless torture of consciousness. She noticed too his careful avoidance of the mirror that hung above the cold hearth, how he positioned himself always with his back to its silvered surface, as though he could not bear to catch even a glimpse of his own reflection, and once when she shifted her chair and the movement caused his image to flash briefly in the glass, she saw him flinch, as though struck, his jaw tightening with something that looked less like vanity than like genuine horror, at the reminder that he still possessed a physical form, that he still occupied space in a world he seemed determined to reject. But it was his response to kindness that Eleanor found most revealing, the way he recoiled from even the smallest gesture of warmth, as though gentleness were a blade pressed against his throat. When she inquired after his health, he answered with cruelty. When she expressed concern for the chill of the unlit room, he accused her of presumption, and when she once reached out to steady a cup he had nearly knocked from the table, her fingers brushed his sleeve, and he jerked away as though her touch had burned him, his grey eyes wild for just a moment, with something that looked terrifyingly like hope, before the familiar mask of disdain slammed back into place. Asterisk. He is not pushing me away because he wishes to be alone, asterisk, Eleanor realized, as she walked home through the autumn dusk, after their fourth meeting. Asterisk. He is pushing me away because he is terrified of what might happen if he allows anyone close enough to see the wounds he carries. He has built this fortress of hostility, not to keep the world out, but to keep himself imprisoned within it, and every act of cruelty is simply another stone added to walls. He believes he deserves asterisk. It was on her 6th visit to Blackmore Hall that Eleanor first glimpsed the sealed corridor, a passage she had somehow failed to notice during her previous journeys through the house's labyrinthine halls. Perhaps because Mrs. Crane had always guided her by the same careful route from entrance to library, or perhaps because the shadows of the east wing seemed to possess a quality of deliberate concealment, a darkness that discouraged the eye from lingering too long upon its threshold. But on this particular Thursday, the housekeeper had been delayed by some domestic crisis in the kitchens, and Eleanor had been left to find her own way through corridors she thought she knew, and it was a wrong turning at the top of the main staircase that brought her face to face with a door unlike any other in the house, a heavy oak portal bound with iron and secured by a lock so large it seemed designed to contain something far more dangerous than empty rooms, and even as she stood before it, she felt a cold draught seeping through the cracks, as though the very air beyond had been sealed away with whatever secrets the chamber held. She might have turned away then, might have retreated to the familiar safety of the library and the strange comfort of Lord Ashford's ritualized hostility, but something in the quality of that cold breath made her pause, made her press her palm flat against the wood, as though she might divine through touch alone what lay beyond. And it was thus that Mrs. Crane found her when the housekeeper came hurrying up the stairs with her keys jangling and her face arranged into an expression of such profound alarm that Eleanor knew immediately she had stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. "That wing is not to be approached, Mrs. Crane said, her voice harder than Eleanor had ever heard it, her thin fingers closing around Eleanor's elbow with a grip that brooked no argument. "It has been sealed since Lady Lydia's time, by his lordship's own orders, and there is nothing beyond that door but dust and grief and memories best left undisturbed," and she pulled Eleanor away with such urgency that her feet stumbled on the worn carpet, but not before Eleanor caught a glimpse of something scratched into the wood near the lock, letters gouged deep as though by desperate fingernails, too faint to read but too deliberate to be anything but intentional. She was still thinking of those marks when she entered the library, still seeing them behind her eyes like an after-image burned by lightning, and so she did not immediately notice that Lord Ashford stood not in his usual position by the cold hearth, but directly before her, his face white as bone, and his grey eyes blazing with a fury so intense it seemed to consume the very air between them. "You were at the east wing door," he said, and his voice was a sound Eleanor had never heard from him before, not the practiced cruelty of their usual encounters, but something raw and ragged and utterly uncontrolled. "You were touching it. I saw you from the gallery. Who gave you permission? Who told you to go there? What do you want from me? What do you want?" And Eleanor saw, then, what lay beneath the fury, saw it clearly for the first time as his voice cracked on the final word, and his hands clenched at his sides with a trembling that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a terror so profound it had driven him to this display, and she understood suddenly that whatever waited behind that sealed door was not a secret he kept from the world, but a wound he kept open deliberately, a blade he pressed against his own heart every hour of every day, and his rage was not that she had discovered his shame, but that she had come too close to seeing the full depth of the suffering he believed he deserved. The weeks that followed the incident at the east wing door moved with the strange suspended quality of late autumn, when the world itself seems to hold its breath before the final descent into winter, and Eleanor continued her Thursday visits despite the memory of Lord Ashford's terrible fury, despite Mrs. Crane's newly watchful presence that ensured she never again strayed from the prescribed path between entrance and library. And something shifted between them after that day, some invisible barrier, cracked, if not broken, as though his explosion of raw terror had exhausted resources he had long hoarded for the maintenance of his defenses, and he began to speak to her with something other than calculated cruelty, began to offer fragments of himself wrapped in bitterness, but offered nonetheless the first gifts he had permitted himself to give in years. "You wonder why I requested your father's counsel," he said one afternoon as November rain traced silver paths down the windows, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded over a volume of devotional poetry she had not opened. "You imagine perhaps that I sought redemption, that somewhere beneath this excellent performance of villainy there beats a heart yearning to return to God's grace. How disappointed you must be to discover the truth is far more pathetic," and he laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. "I wrote that letter in a moment of weakness, Miss Hartwell, a moment when the silence of this house became so absolute I thought I might cease to exist entirely if I did not hear another human voice, and your father's reputation for kindness toward the wretched seemed to promise at least an hour's respite from my own company." And Eleanor heard beneath the self-mockery something she had learned to recognize, the particular cadence of confession disguised as contempt. He told her over the following weeks, in pieces and fragments scattered through their conversations like shards of a shattered mirror, that he had not always been Lord Ashford of Blackmore Hall, that before the death of his elder brother and the inheritance that followed like a curse, he had been simply Marcus Ashford, physician, trained at Edinburgh and practicing in London among the poor of Whitechapel. And when he spoke of those years, Eleanor saw his hands change, saw them move with a different quality, as though remembering the work they had been made for, and she understood suddenly why the library was filled with medical texts, why she had noticed on his desk scattered papers covered in precise anatomical drawings, why his fingers even now traced the air sometimes as though reaching for instruments no longer there. "I was good," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something precious. "I was very good, Miss Hartwell. I had a gift for diagnosis that my professors called almost supernatural. I could feel the wrongness in a body the way some men feel changes in weather, and I believed God helped me. I actually believed that I could save them, that these hands could hold back death itself, if only I worked hard enough, if only I refused to surrender." And his voice cracked on the final word, and Eleanor saw his surgeon's hands clench into fists against his thighs, those elegant, capable fingers that had been trained to heal, now twisted into instruments of his own punishment, and she recognized at last what she had sensed from their first meeting, that Lord Marcus Ashford was not a monster who had destroyed his wives, but a healer who had failed to save them, and the difference between those two truths was the entire distance between damnation and the possibility of grace. It was not her intention to discover the garden, for Eleanor had learned through careful weeks of navigating both the labyrinthine corridors of Blackmore Hall and the equally treacherous terrain of Lord Ashford's moods, that the safest path was always the prescribed one, the route Mrs. Crane had established from entrance to library and back again without deviation. But on the first Thursday of December, when frost silvered the moors and her breath hung in clouds before her face, she arrived to find the library empty and the fire unlit, and after waiting for nearly an hour in the growing cold, she made the decision that would alter everything. Rising from her usual chair and following the distant sound that had been teasing at the edges of her awareness, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the French doors at the library's far end, doors she had assumed led nowhere, sealed against the elements like so much else in this house of deliberate decay, but which yielded when she pressed the handle and opened onto a scene so unexpected that for a moment she could only stand on the threshold and stare at the impossible tableau before her. The garden had once been beautiful, she could see that in the bones of it, in the geometric paths now choked with dead weeds, in the stone urns toppled and cracked by seasons of neglect, In the skeletal remains of what must have been elaborate rose arbors arching over walkways that led to a central fountain, long since dry and filled with rotting leaves. But what stopped her breath was not the garden's ruin, but its gardener, for there among the thorns and frost-blackened stems knelt Lord Marcus Ashford, his fine coat discarded on the frozen ground, his white shirt stained with earth and sweat, despite the bitter cold, his bare hands bleeding from a dozen scratches as he worked with desperate tenderness to clear the debris from around a single surviving rosebush. And when he heard her step on the stone threshold and turned to face her, Eleanor saw in his grey eyes not the fury she expected, but something far more devastating, a grief so raw and undefended that she felt she had stumbled upon him in a moment of prayer, had witnessed a communion too sacred for any witness. "Catherine planted these," he said, and his voice held none of its usual sharp edges, none of the practiced cruelty he wielded like armor, only a terrible naked softness that made Eleanor want to weep. "She planted them the spring after we married. She had such plans for this garden. She would sketch designs by candlelight and tell me where each variety would go, the damask roses here and the alba roses there, and she would describe how the colors would look in June when everything bloomed together. She could see it so clearly, Miss Hartwell. She could see the future as though it were already real." And his bleeding hands continued their work even as he spoke, clearing and tending with a physician's precision. "A lover's devotion. She was carrying our child when she planted this one." She laughed and said the roses and the baby would grow together, would bloom in the same summer, and his voice finally broke on the word summer, cracked like ice over deep water. "I delivered 100 babies in Whitechapel. I saved mothers that other doctors had given up for dead. I had hands that could feel when something was wrong before any symptom appeared, and I could not save her. I could not save either of them. I held them both as they died, and these hands that everyone called miraculous could do nothing. Nothing." And Eleanor crossed the frozen garden without conscious decision, knelt beside him in the frost-hardened earth, and took his bleeding hands in her own, holding them gently, saying nothing, because there were no words for such grief, only presence, only the simple human gift of witnessing another's pain without turning away. They remained in the frozen garden until the winter light began to fail, and when at last Marcus rose and helped Eleanor to her feet, brushing the frost from her skirts with hands that had finally stopped bleeding, something had shifted between them that could not be unnamed, some threshold crossed that permitted him to speak of what he had never spoken of to any living soul. And so it was that the following Thursday, in the library where a fire now burned because he had ordered it lit before her arrival, he told her about Lydia, and his voice as he spoke held neither the bitter mockery nor the raw grief she had witnessed before, but something perhaps more terrible, a flat recitation of facts that she recognized as the particular numbness of shame, too deep for ordinary expression. "My brother's death came 18 months after Catherine's," he said, standing at the window with his back to her so she could not see his face. "And suddenly I was Lord Ashford, master of Blackmore Hall, expected to marry again and produce an heir, to continue a lineage I had never wanted, and now despised. Lydia was chosen for me by distant relations who still believed the family name worth preserving. She was young and wealthy and from a good family, and I married her because I had ceased to care about anything at all, because it seemed easier to do what was expected than to fight, because some part of me believed that perhaps duty could serve where love had failed." And Eleanor heard in his words the terrible mathematics of grief, the way sorrow sometimes calculates that any change must be better than the unchanging weight of loss. "She was not well," he continued, and his voice grew quieter still. "I knew it from the beginning. I saw the signs. I had been trained to recognize the wild fluctuations of mood, the terrors that came upon her without warning, the way she would sometimes speak to people who were not there, and I did nothing. Miss Hartwell, I told myself it was not my concern. I had married her body for the production of heirs and her fortune for the maintenance of this rotting estate. I had not agreed to tend her mind or heart. I had given those capacities to Catherine and buried them with her, and had nothing left to offer." And he turned then, and Eleanor saw that his face was not blank as she had expected, but twisted with a self-loathing so profound it seemed to distort his very features. "She fell from the cliffs on a morning in March," he said, "and the coroner ruled it an accident because that was the convenient conclusion, because the alternative would have meant scandal and investigation and questions no one wished to answer. But I knew. I knew she had walked to those cliffs deliberately. I knew because I had seen her standing at the edge a dozen times before. I knew because she had begged me for help in ways I had refused to hear. And I let her die, Miss Hartwell. As surely as if I had pushed her myself, I let her die, because I was too consumed with my own grief to see that she was drowning in hers, because I had decided I was incapable of saving anyone, and so I stopped trying. And that is the truth of the Widowmaker. That is the monster the village whispers about. Not a man who murdered his wives, but something perhaps worse. A physician who forgot how to heal, a husband who forgot how to see, a human being who forgot that other hearts besides his own could break. The fever came upon her father without warning on the coldest night of January, striking with the swiftness and severity that Eleanor had learned to fear in the long years of tending to his declining health, and by midnight she knew with terrible certainty that this was not like the other illnesses, not like the coughs that lingered or the weakness that came and went with the seasons. This was something else entirely, something that made his skin burn like fire beneath her hands, while his body shook with chills so violent the bed frame rattled against the wall. And she did everything she knew to do, applied cold compresses and forced sips of water between his cracked lips, and prayed with a desperation that felt like drowning. But nothing helped, nothing changed, and by 3 in the morning she had sent for the village doctor, only to learn he was away attending a difficult birth in the next county, and would not return for days. And she knelt beside her father's bed, and held his burning hand, and prepared herself to watch another parent die, prepared herself for the particular grief of being the one left behind, the one who survives, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats in the frozen lane outside, and then the violent pounding on the vicarage door that brought her stumbling down the stairs with no thought for propriety or the lateness of the hour. And when she opened the door to find Lord Marcus Ashford standing on the threshold, his dark coat dusted with snow and his physician's bag clutched in one ungloved hand, she felt something give way in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite hope, but some desperate combination of both. "Mrs. Crane told me you did not come today," he said without preamble, his grey eyes already looking past her into the darkened house. "And when I sent a man to inquire, your neighbour said the vicar had taken gravely ill. Where is he? Miss Hartwell, take me to him now." And she led him up the narrow stairs without question, too exhausted and too frightened to marvel at the impossibility of his presence, at the way the Widowmaker of village legend was now bending over her father's wasted form, with hands that moved with the sure precision of long practice, checking pulse and temperature and the rhythm of labored breathing, his face transforming before her eyes into something she had never seen there before. Not grief, not bitterness, not the terrible self-loathing that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection, but focus, pure and absolute, the concentration of a man who had found his purpose again after long years of wandering in the wilderness of his own guilt. "Lung fever," he said, already opening his bag and removing bottles and instruments. "Advanced, but not beyond treatment. If we act quickly, I will need hot water, clean cloths, and your willingness to follow my instructions exactly. Can you do this, Miss Hartwell? Can you trust me with his life?" And Eleanor met his eyes and saw there a question that went far beyond the medical, a plea for faith from a man who had forgotten how to have faith in himself, and she answered with the only word that mattered, the only word she had ever meant more completely: yes. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched into an eternity of fever and fear, of cold compresses applied and reapplied, of medicines administered with careful precision, of prayers murmured beneath Eleanor's breath, while Marcus worked with the focused intensity of a man fighting a battle he had once believed himself too broken to wage. And it was in the deepest hollow of that night, when her father's breathing had finally steadied into something less terrifying, and Marcus had sunk into the chair beside the sickbed with the exhaustion of a soldier after combat, that the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself began at last to crumble entirely, not with the dramatic collapse of a fortress under siege, but with the quiet erosion of stone, worn smooth by water, by time, by the simple, persistent presence of someone who refused to look away. "You should rest," Eleanor whispered from her place on the floor beside her father's bed, her back against the wall and her eyes burning with fatigue. But Marcus shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the room, beyond the village, beyond perhaps the boundaries of the living world itself. "I cannot remember the last time I slept without dreaming of them," he said, and his voice held a rawness she had never heard there before. Stripped of mockery, stripped of bitterness, stripped of everything but the naked truth of a soul too weary to hide anymore. Catherine calling for me from some dark place I cannot reach. Lydia standing at the edge of those cliffs with her arms spread wide like wings, and I run toward them, but I am always too slow, always too late, always the physician who could not heal, the husband who could not save, and I wake, and I am grateful for a moment that it was only a dream, before I remember that it was not a dream at all, that they are truly gone, and I am truly the reason, and then I wish. He stopped, his jaw tightening against words that fought to escape, but Eleanor waited in the silence with the patience she had learned in months of sitting beside him while he found his way toward speech. And at last he continued in a whisper so low she had to lean forward to hear, "I have wished for death, Miss Hartwell, not with the courage to pursue it as Lydia did, but with the coward's hope that it might simply come for me, that some illness or accident might release me from the prison of my own existence, and when it did not come, when I continued to wake each morning in that mausoleum of a house, I decided that if I could not die, I would make myself into something so monstrous that no one would ever come close enough to be destroyed by me again. I would become the Widowmaker they whispered about. I would make the legend true in spirit, if not in fact. I would build walls of cruelty and reputation so high that no kindness could scale them, no compassion could breach them, no foolish vicar's daughter with her books, and her stubborn faith, and her eyes that saw too much could ever." And here his voice broke entirely, shattered on the rocks of his own confession, and Eleanor rose from the floor and crossed the small distance between them and did what she had wanted to do since the day she first saw him. Standing in the rain-soaked churchyard with grief carved into every line of his face, took his hand in hers and held it, simply held it, and felt him tremble like a man who had forgotten what it was to be touched without violence, to be seen without judgment, to be offered grace he had convinced himself he could never deserve. The fever broke on the third day, receding like a tide that had threatened to drown them all but chose instead, at the last possible moment, to show mercy, and when Reverend Hartwell opened his eyes and looked upon his daughter's exhausted face with recognition and clarity, when he spoke her name in a voice ravaged by illness but unmistakably alive, Eleanor wept with a relief so profound it seemed to empty her of everything she had been holding inside throughout those endless hours of vigil. And it was only later, after her father had taken broth and slept a natural healing sleep, that she realized Marcus had slipped away, sometime in the grey hours of early morning without farewell or explanation, leaving behind only the bottles of medicine on the nightstand and instructions written in his precise physician's hand for the continuation of care. And when the village doctor finally returned and examined the vicar with wondering eyes, he declared it nothing short of miraculous that the illness had not claimed him, that whoever had treated him had done so with extraordinary skill, and Reverend Hartwell, still weak but already displaying the stubborn vitality that had carried him through decades of service, said simply, "It was Lord Ashford, the master of Blackmore Hall, who sat beside me through the darkest night and fought for my life as though it were his own." And the doctor's face betrayed such astonishment that Eleanor might have laughed under different circumstances, and within hours the news had spread through Thornhaven, like fire through dry grass. The Widowmaker had saved the vicar's life, the monster of local legend had worked through the night with healing hands, the very man they had whispered about in fearful tones had proven himself capable of something that looked remarkably like compassion, and Eleanor watched the village's perception shift with the strange mixture of vindication and sorrow, knowing that Marcus would hate this attention, this reassessment, this crack in the fortress of his terrible reputation. And indeed, when she went to Blackmore Hall 3 days later, her father finally stable enough to leave in the care of parish women, she found the gates locked and her knock unanswered, and when she returned the following day and the day after that, it was Mrs. Crane who finally appeared at the servants' entrance with something almost like sympathy in her weathered face, saying, "He's given orders, miss, no visitors, no exceptions, says he's done what needed doing and there's nothing more to discuss." And Eleanor stood in the frozen February air and felt something kindle in her chest that was neither despair nor acceptance, but rather a quiet, fierce determination that had been building since the night she held his trembling hand in the darkness of her father's sick room, since she heard him confess the wish for death that had haunted him, since she understood at last that his retreat was not rejection, but terror. Terror of hope, terror of connection, terror of allowing himself to want something he believed he could never deserve. And she looked at the grey stones of Blackmore Hall rising against the winter sky, and made a decision as clear and unshakable as any she had ever made, that she would not let him disappear into the prison of his guilt, that she would not allow him to transform one night of grace into another chain of self-punishment, that whatever walls he built, she would find a way through, because she had seen what lay beneath his careful cruelty, and she would not abandon it to the darkness. The storm came as though summoned by the tumult in Eleanor's heart, sweeping across the moors with the fury of something ancient and unforgiving, and she walked into its teeth without hesitation, her cloak snapping behind her like a dark wing as she climbed the path to Blackmore Hall with a determination that bordered on recklessness. 2 weeks she had waited, 2 weeks of locked gates and unanswered letters, 2 weeks of watching her father regain his strength, while the man who had saved him withered in his self-imposed exile, and she could bear it no longer, could not sit in her quiet vicarage while Marcus Ashford slowly killed himself with solitude and guilt. And so she had come through the howling wind and the driving rain, come to the servants' entrance that Mrs. Crane had left unlatched with a look that might have been hope, come through the cold corridors she now knew well enough to navigate in darkness, and she found him in the library where they had first spoken all those months ago, standing before the dead fireplace with a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand and his back turned to her as though he had been waiting, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with exhaustion and something that sounded terribly like surrender. "I told Mrs. Crane no visitors," and Eleanor answered with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, "and I told myself I would not watch you destroy yourself from a comfortable distance." And he turned, then, and she saw what 2 weeks of darkness had done to him, the hollows deeper beneath his eyes, the gauntness more pronounced, the careful cruelty replaced by something worse, a blankness that spoke of a man who had stopped fighting, and the sight of it kindled in her a fury so bright it burned away. Her caution, her propriety, every gentle approach she had planned during those long nights of waiting. "You saved my father's life," she said, advancing into the room as lightning split the sky beyond the windows. "You sat beside his bed and fought for him as though he mattered, as though life mattered, and then you retreated to this mausoleum to convince yourself that the man who did that kindness doesn't deserve to exist. Do you understand how cruel that is? Not to me, not to the village, but to yourself. To punish yourself for daring to be something other than the monster you've decided you must be?" And Marcus's face contorted with something between anguish and anger as he slammed the glass down upon the mantel. "You don't understand. I am not punishing myself for kindness. I am protecting you, protecting everyone, from what happens to those foolish enough to care for me, to depend upon me. Catherine trusted me and died in agony, calling my name. Lydia needed me, and I was too consumed with my own grief to see her drowning until she chose the cliffs over another day, as my wife. And you," his voice cracked, shattered on the rocks of his terror, "you with your stubborn faith and your refusal to see what is plainly before you, you would be the third woman destroyed by the catastrophe of loving Marcus Ashford, and I will not allow it. I cannot." And Eleanor crossed the remaining distance between them and seized his hands in hers, felt them trembling with the force of his fear, and she said with a fierceness that surprised them both, "You do not get to make that choice for me. You do not get to decide what I am strong enough to bear or wise enough to understand. I have seen you, Marcus, all of you, the grief and the guilt and the desperate wish for death and the healing hands you tried to bury and the heart you convinced yourself had stopped beating. I have seen it all, and I am still here, still standing before you in this storm, demanding that you stop hiding from the terrifying possibility that you might deserve to live, that you might be worthy of connection, of hope, of—" And she stopped, the word trembling on her lips, the word that had been growing in her chest for weeks, and Marcus stared at her with an expression of such raw, desperate longing that it stole her breath, and he whispered, "Don't." But it was not a command, it was a plea, the plea of a man who wanted nothing more than to hear what she might say next, and feared nothing more than the same. And the storm raged on around Blackmore Hall as two souls stood at the edge of an abyss that was not destruction but transformation, and waited to see who would find the courage to leap first. The storm had gentled to a steady rain when Marcus finally spoke again, his voice barely audible above the water streaming down the windows. "If you truly wish to understand what you are asking for, what loving me would mean, then come let me show you the truth I have hidden from everyone. The room where my guilt lives and breathes," and Eleanor followed him through the darkened corridors of Blackmore Hall, past the familiar library and the neglected parlours, until they stood before the door to the east wing, the forbidden threshold she had glimpsed months ago and been warned away from with such fury, and Marcus's hand trembled as he produced the key, as the lock yielded with a sound like something sighing after a long-held breath, and he pushed open the door to reveal a corridor thick with shadows and the particular stillness of spaces long sealed from the living world, and Eleanor walked beside him through the dust and the silence until they reached a room at the corridor's end. And when he opened this final door, she understood at last why he had kept this place locked away. It was Lydia's chamber, preserved exactly as it must have been on the day she died. The bed still made with its rumpled coverlet, a hairbrush lying on the vanity as though waiting for its owner's return. But it was the walls that stole Eleanor's breath, for they were covered in writing, desperate scrawlings in what must have been charcoal and ink, and what she feared might be blood, words and fragments and pleas that spoke of a mind in torment. Phrases like, "He doesn't see me," and "I am disappearing," and "The sea calls and calls, and I am so tired of not answering." And Marcus stood in the center of this shrine to his failure, his face carved from stone but his eyes alive with an anguish that had not diminished with the passing years. "I found her writings after," he said, his voice hollow. "Read every word, understood too late what I had refused to see. While she lived, she was drowning in her own mind, and I was too consumed with my grief for Catherine, too determined to maintain the proper distance of a marriage of convenience, to notice that my wife was slipping away day by day, and so I have kept this room exactly as she left it, made myself come here and read her words, made myself remember that my blindness killed her as surely as the rocks at the cliff's base." And Eleanor moved through the room slowly, reading the fragments on the walls, seeing in them not an indictment of Marcus but the evidence of an illness he could not have cured with attention alone. And she turned to him with tears on her cheeks and said, "You have made this room your prison, but Marcus," these words, they speak of a darkness that lived inside her long before you, a darkness that would have claimed her regardless of how closely you watched, how much you tried to save her, and keeping this shrine does not honor Lydia. It only chains you to a guilt that serves no one, least of all the woman who suffered here." And she took his hand and led him to the window where rain traced its endless patterns on the glass. "It is time to let her rest, truly rest, and to forgive yourself for being human, for not being able to save everyone you love. That is not failure, Marcus. That is simply the terrible cost of being alive." And in the grey light of that haunted room, she watched something shift in his face, something that might have been the first trembling movements of a man learning to set down a burden he had carried for far too long. They stood in silence as the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows of Lydia's room, and Eleanor watched the transformation moving across Marcus's features, like dawn breaking over a landscape that had known only night. The rigid lines of his jaw softening, the desperate grip of his guilt loosening its hold finger by finger, and when he finally turned to face her fully, she saw in his eyes something she had never seen there before, something that looked terribly like hope, struggling to survive in soil that had been salted with years of grief. And his voice when he spoke was rough and uncertain, the voice of a man attempting a language he had forgotten. "Eleanor, what you have given me tonight, the grace of your understanding, the gift of your refusal to let me remain in my darkness. I do not have words sufficient to—" And he stopped, his physician's hands that had healed her father, now reaching toward her face as though she were something precious and fragile, hovering just shy of touching her cheek. "I love you," he said, and the words seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep within him, some place he had boarded up and abandoned. "God help me. I love you in a way I did not believe myself still capable of feeling. But Eleanor, you must understand what I am. I am ruins. I am a man who has failed everyone who ever trusted him with their heart. And you deserve so much more than the wreckage of Marcus Ashford. You deserve someone whole, someone unshadowed, someone who can give you a future unburdened by the weight of 2 graves and a reputation that will follow us like a curse. And I will not add your name to the list of women destroyed by loving me." And Eleanor listened to his declaration, and his denial in the same breath. Felt her heart breaking and mending simultaneously, at the sound of love spoken as though it were a tragedy, and she reached up and took his hovering hand and pressed it firmly against her cheek, held it there so he could feel the warmth of her, the reality of her, and she said with a certainty that came from the deepest part of her soul, "You speak of what I deserve as though I am a child who cannot determine her own fate, as though my choice in this matter is irrelevant. But hear me, Marcus Ashford, hear me, and believe me. I choose you, not the man you might have been before grief carved its marks upon you, not some imagined future version healed and whole, but you, exactly as you stand before me now, with your wounds and your guilt and your terrible fear of happiness. I choose you because I have seen who you truly are, beneath the armor you built to keep the world at bay. I have seen the physician who sat vigil over my father, the gardener who tends roses for a woman he couldn't save, the man who kept a room as penance because his conscience would accept nothing less. I choose all of it, and I am not afraid." And something in Marcus shattered at her words, not the destructive shattering of breaking, but the liberating shattering of walls finally falling, and he pulled her close with a sound that was half sob and half prayer, and when his lips found hers, it was not with passion alone, but with reverence, with gratitude, with the desperate, tender hunger of a man who had wandered in darkness for years, and finally been offered light. Spring came to Thornhaven as it always did, with the slow unfurling of green across the moors and the gradual lengthening of days that had seemed endless in their winter darkness. But this spring carried with it something the village had never witnessed, the resurrection of Blackmore Hall and the man who had haunted its corridors like a spectre of grief and guilt, for in the weeks following that rain-soaked night, when Eleanor had broken through the final walls of Marcus's isolation, changes began to manifest that set tongues wagging with a different kind of whisper, no longer the fearful murmurings about the Widowmaker, but wondering observations about the windows being thrown open to the spring air, about the sounds of hammers and the sight of workmen arriving from the city to repair the crumbling masonry and replace the rotted window frames, and most remarkably of all, about Lord Ashford himself appearing in the village with Eleanor at his side, his gaunt face still severe but no longer shuttered, his dark eyes still carrying the shadows of his past, but now lit with something that looked almost like peace, and the villagers watched in astonishment as he began to practice medicine again, treating old Mrs. Pemberton's rheumatism and setting young Thomas Fletcher's broken arm with hands that had remembered their purpose, their gift for healing, no longer buried beneath layers of self-punishment, and the vicar, recovered now, and walking with a cane but walking nonetheless, blessed the union when Marcus came to him with Eleanor's hand clasped in his own and asked formally for permission to marry his daughter, and the old man had looked at the transformed lord and seen what his daughter had seen all along, not a monster but a man who had lost his way in the labyrinth of grief and found his path again through the patient light of love. And so it was that on a morning in late May, when Catherine's roses were beginning to bloom in the restored garden of Blackmore Hall, the village church filled with people who had once crossed the street to avoid the shadow of Lord Ashford, who had whispered "Widowmaker" behind their hands and warned their children about the devil on the hill, and they sat in their pews and watched as Marcus stood at the altar in the small stone church where Eleanor had grown up, his face stripped of its armor, his eyes fixed on the door through which she would walk, and when she appeared in a simple white gown with wildflowers woven through her hair, he drew a breath that seemed to fill his lungs for the first time in years, and the ceremony was quiet and sincere, the vows spoken with the gravity of two people who understood exactly what they were promising, because they had already weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser loves, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Marcus kissed his bride in the church, where she had prayed for him before she ever knew his name, the bells rang out across Thornhaven with a sound like joy itself, like the village acknowledging that redemption was possible even for those who seemed most lost. And Eleanor looked up at her husband, and saw the man she had always known existed beneath the legend, the healer, the gardener, the soul worth saving, finally allowing himself to be saved. 7 years had passed since the spring morning when Eleanor Hartwell became Eleanor Ashford, 7 years that had transformed Blackmore Hall from a mausoleum of grief into a home alive with warmth and laughter and the chaotic, beautiful noise of children. And on this particular autumn afternoon, an afternoon that echoed with golden light, so different from the storm that had first brought Marcus to Thornhaven. Eleanor stood at the window of what had once been Lydia's room, now a bright nursery where their youngest daughter slept in a cradle carved by her father's own hands, and she watched through glass no longer streaked with neglect, as Marcus walked through Catherine's garden with their twin sons balanced on each hip, their dark hair so like his own, their laughter ringing across the restored grounds as he pointed out the roses and spoke to them of the gentle woman who had planted them, teaching them that love persists even through loss, that memory can be honored without becoming a prison. And Eleanor's heart swelled with a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes, for she remembered the man she had first encountered in that rain-soaked churchyard, the spectre of guilt and self-destruction who had wanted nothing more than to disappear into his own darkness, and she marveled at the distance between that man and the father, now spinning his sons until they shrieked with delight, the physician who had reopened his practice and served the village that had once whispered his name like a curse, the husband who still looked at her each morning as though he could not quite believe she was real. And later that evening, when the children were asleep and the house had settled into its peaceful nighttime quiet, Marcus found Eleanor in the garden among the roses that bloomed now more beautifully than ever, tended with love rather than penance, and he took her hand and raised it to his lips and said simply, "You saved me." And she shook her head and replied, "No, my love, you saved yourself. I merely refused to let you forget that you were worth saving." And they stood together in the gathering dusk, two people who had found in each other not the absence of pain but the courage to carry it together, to transform it into something that fed the roots of joy rather than strangling them. Dear listener, if this story has stirred something within you, some recognition of your own shadows or your own desperate hope for redemption, then carry with you this truth that Eleanor understood from the first moment she looked into Marcus Ashford's haunted eyes. There is no soul so lost that patience cannot find it, no heart so broken that love cannot begin to mend it, no darkness so complete that light cannot eventually pierce its edges. For we are none of us the worst thing we have ever done or failed to do. We are all of us works in progress, capable of transformation that seems impossible until the moment it begins. And if you find yourself playing the role of Marcus, convinced of your own unworthiness, remember that somewhere there may be an Eleanor waiting to see past your armor, or perhaps you are called to be the Eleanor in someone else's story, the steady presence that refuses to abandon hope. And either way, know this, redemption is not a destination but a journey, not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of small choices to remain open, to remain present, to believe that spring will come again, even in the depths of the harshest winter. So go gently into whatever storms await you, and may you find your way home to gardens in bloom and halls filled with laughter, to love that resurrects rather than destroys, to peace that passes understanding, and to rest, dear listener, to rest at last.